Okay, we are going to talk about foreign policy. Foreign policy, I chose this picture of President Trump and Vladimir Putin to show that at some point we did have, relations. Same thing. President Trump was the first U.S. president to step across the demilitarized zone in North Korea to visit with Kim Jong Un. Kind of a foreign policy pioneer there. So, what is foreign policy? Foreign policy, those are the goals that a state's officials, so a state being a country, seek to obtain abroad. The value that gives rise to those objectives and what do we do to pursue them? So remember, we talked about domestic policy, and that sticks to things that are just happening here in the United States, versus foreign policy is how we deal with people and countries abroad. So here's a picture that shows the House Minority Leader, Nancy Pelosi. It's an older picture. She joined the UN General Secretary, Ban Ki-moon, and other dignitaries to commemorate the adoption of the UN Charter in San Francisco. So, think of the United Nations. That is one element of international human rights. It's a organization that, we have an ambassador to and helps us with foreign policy. Here's another picture. You may recognize this picture if you're old enough. Many of you might have been kids during this. To think about it now, I feel old. But this is the government officials watching the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound back in 2011, where he was subsequently killed. So what do we do? Why do we do foreign policy? We want to protect the U.S. and its citizens. We want to maintain access to key resources in the markets. We want to preserve the balance of power in the world and protect human rights and democracy. These are all important things. For example, not saying it's right or wrong, just using it as an example, is the Biden administration sending money and weapons to Ukraine. Ukraine is a very tiny little blip of a country, whereas Russia, who has invaded them, is one of the largest countries in the world. There's a definite imbalance of power. We recently did a hostage exchange for Americans who were imprisoned in Iran. And we did a prisoner swap to protect the U.S. and its citizens. There's certain key resources in the markets. Arguably a lot of things happen because of oil. And then we do believe in human rights and democracy. But I would argue to you, based on human rights issues in China, based on human rights issues in Afghanistan, North Korea, we're not really doing a good job. Think of the millions of people who are in prison camps in North Korea, or the Uyghurs in China, or the women of Afghanistan, right? So we have different types of foreign policy: trade, diplomacy, sanctions. When the war in Ukraine started, we saw a lot of sanctions go on Russian oligarchs and different things owned by Russia. Military defense, intelligence. We have major intelligence sharing operations throughout the world. Foreign aid, the money, and then global environmental policy. Can we come together, for the common good? So these three are former secretaries of state. So you see Madeleine Albright, she was the first female Secretary of State. She was nominated by President Clinton. Colin Powell, he was a former military general who became Secretary of State. And then Condoleezza Rice was another, she teaches at Stanford now. Following that, in the Trump era, we had Rex Tillerson. And then he ended his presidency with Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. Mike Pompeo just wrote a really good book called Never Give an Inch about his time as Secretary of State. I highly encourage it. Be a good read. It's a very fun book. Yeah. So challenges in foreign policy. Okay, so I always think about this, right? The U.S. owes debt to China so much. So how does China collect on it? There's no world bankruptcy court, right? So there is no true world level authority dictating how we should deal with each other. The closest we have is the United Nations. But then again, you have the United Nations. In Europe, you have the European Union. In Africa, you have an African coalition of of human rights. You have something similar in Asia. So we have all these different human rights authorities, but no real way saying how we should treat each other. And the problem with these human rights authorities is that there's no teeth in them, meaning if you violate a human right, what are we going to do about it? So different countries have different views about the role of government in people's lives. That's the different types of forms of governing. We have democracy here. In Russia, there's communism. In England, it's a monarchy. And so, this kind of shows how they deal with people. Many foreign policy issues transcend across borders, right? This one example, again, the war in Ukraine has seen an influx of refugees in countries surrounding it. Varying conditions in different countries in the world also affect what is possible in foreign and diplomatic relations. Here's an example back in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Russia it was the Soviet Union then, but they were storing ballistic missiles in Cuba so they could come and launch across the United States. Here's an example of the crisis. There's President Kennedy and the pilots who saw it. So broadly focused, foreign policy outputs typically bring more involvement from Congress and other world leaders. This can be public laws, the periodic authorization of the foreign policy agencies, foreign policy budget, international agreements, and the appointment of new executive officials and ambassadors. Then sharply focused US foreign policy. These are faster response, right? So sending troops or intelligence experts, have a presidential summit, or the passage of emergency funding for specific issues. So Congress, of course, remember that the president and Congress, they have to work kind of hand in hand in foreign policy. The president is our chief diplomat, but Congress has to authorize a lot. So Congress enacts public laws, there's certain laws that affect more than a certain individual. They have the War Powers Resolution. So Congress, remember, is the only one who can declare war, but the president can send troops for anything under 60 days. So that's what, foreign policy and defense budgets are parts of the discretionary budget. Important to note that the defense budget is separate when I talk about government shutdowns. So that part will be exempt from shutdown. So emergency spending does not involve Congress, but now it does involve Congress as far as like the money going to Ukraine or money going to other foreign countries. Congress does need to pass it. Then we have shared power in this foreign policy making. You may have recalled when Nancy Pelosi made her trip to Taiwan, as Speaker of the House. So it's not just the president that goes out and represents the United States in these foreign countries. Presidents are more empowered by the Constitution, but interesting book I'm reading for a class saying that the U.S. not one branch can do anything together, right? This shared power. So the president leads more in foreign policy than domestic policy, because domestic policy is more left to Congress and the states. Because the president, he's our commander in chief of the military. He is the one who nominates ambassadors, and he's the one who starts, us into treaties. So he really is the leader. The president, he sets the agenda for foreign policy and may move unilaterally in some instances. This is where this idea of an executive agreement comes in, where the president he could enter into an agreement if he knew Senate was not going to further ratify the treaty. And then there's individual House and Senate members, but they rarely venture into foreign policy because they want to focus on their constituents, right? If they spend all their time in a foreign country, their constituents are not going to reelect them. So it's not really worth it for them. But there are, different people who may carry out foreign policy: the president and vice president, the president's chief of staff, secretary of state, secretary of defense, and secretary of homeland security. the National Security Advisor, a U.S. Trade Representative, the Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. All of these people fall under the executive branch. See that? And these are our main foreign policy actors. So a lot of times who you'll see dealing with foreign policy, you'll usually see, obviously, the Secretary of State deals with things going abroad, defense, and the NSA go a lot. In Mike Pompeo's book, when he was director of the CIA, he also went on some trips. So it all depends on what the goal is, right? You wouldn't send the Secretary of Defense if it was an issue on trade. You wouldn't send, yeah. Okay, so there's different schools of thought on foreign policy. Briefly go over some of them. So we have this idea of isolationism. Sorry, my alarms are going off. Isolation, that's a foreign policy approach that advocates a nation staying out of foreign entanglements and keeping it to itself. So, of course, that's an ideology. I know I've had some students tell me before, the U.S. needs to learn how to stay out of other people's business. We have liberal internationalism, and that's an approach of becoming proactively engaged by cooperating in a community of nations. So just kind of signing on with the UN, right? Okay. Then we had conservative thoughts, which is neo-conservatism, and that's the belief that rather than exercising restraint, the U.S. could aggressively use its might to promote its values and ideals around the world. We kind of do that, don't we? Then we have neo-isolationism that says the U.S. should be distancing from the UN and other international organizations. That's an interesting one because the UN doesn't really do us a lot of favors. And then selective engagement is a policy of retaining a strong military presence and remaining engaged across the world. So we have all these different ways of defining foreign policy. I encourage you, when you look at things across, that are happening across the world, look to see if you see any of these schools of thought. All righty, that is the end of this lecture. I'm getting them shorter and shorter for you guys, so you guys pay attention and keep watching.